In the winter of 1991, a social worker named Margaret Hines arrived at a farmhouse in rural Kentucky with a court order and a police escort. What she found inside that house would later be described in sealed documents as incompatible with known child development. The Devlin children, 7 of them, ranging from 4 to 17 years old, were discovered living in conditions that defied explanation. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what the children said when they were finally interviewed. The disturbing part was what they knew. And the disturbing part was the realization that their parents had been preparing them for something the rest of the world had forgotten was coming. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Devlin family had lived on the same 200 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky, for 3 generations. The property sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't been maintained since the coal mines closed in 1973. Neighbors were few and far between, and those who remembered the Devlins described them as polite, religious, and intensely private. Thomas Devlin and his wife, Ruth, homeschooled their children and rarely came into town except to buy supplies. They attended no church. They joined no community events. They existed on the periphery of society, which in rural Appalachia was not entirely unusual. What drew attention to the family was not suspicion but accident. In December of 1990, a postal carrier noticed that mail had been piling up in the Devlin mailbox for over 2 weeks. Concerned, he contacted the county sheriff. When deputies arrived at the property, they found Thomas Devlin unconscious in the barn, suffering from what appeared to be a stroke. Ruth was in the house, unresponsive, and later diagnosed with advanced pneumonia. Both parents were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. It was only then that authorities realized there were children in the home, children no one had seen in years. Social services were called. Margaret Hines, a caseworker with over 15 years of experience, was assigned to assess the children and determine their immediate needs. What she walked into that January afternoon would haunt her for the rest of her career. The house itself was structurally sound but strangely outfitted. The windows had been covered with blackout curtains. The pantry was stocked with decades-old canned goods, many of them bulging and rusted. In the basement, she found rows of bunk beds, each fitted with wool blankets and labeled with a child's name. There were no toys, no books except for a single King James Bible and a series of hand-drawn maps she couldn't immediately identify. And the children, the 7 Devlin children, stared at her with expressions that were not fear, not confusion, but something closer to pity. The children were taken into temporary state custody while their parents remained hospitalized. Standard procedure required medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and interviews to determine if neglect or abuse had occurred. What the evaluators discovered was both baffling and deeply unsettling. Physically, the children were malnourished but not starved. They showed signs of vitamin deficiencies and had never received vaccinations, but there were no broken bones, no scars consistent with violence, no evidence of sexual abuse. Psychologically, however, they existed in a category the state had no framework for. The oldest child, 17-year-old Samuel Devlin, spoke in a calm, measured tone that unnerved the intake counselor. He referred to the outside world as the surface and seemed confused by basic questions about school, television, or friends. When asked what he did all day, he explained that he and his siblings followed a strict schedule. Physical training at dawn, educational lessons until noon, survival drills in the afternoon, and prayer before sleep. The lessons, he said, were taught by their parents using materials their grandfather had written. The survival drills included fire starting, water purification, food rationing, and something he called silent movement protocols. The younger children corroborated Samuel's account, though their answers were more fragmented. 10-year-old Esther spoke about the event as if it were a historical fact everyone knew. 8-year-old Caleb drew pictures of underground tunnels and families huddled in darkness. The youngest, 4-year-old Miriam, barely spoke at all, but when she did, she whispered about the sky burning and the bad air. None of the children asked about their parents. None of them cried. When a psychologist introduced a stuffed animal to Miriam, she stared at it as though it were an artifact from another civilization. Margaret Hines requested access to the Devlin home to gather more information. What she found in Thomas Devlin's study would later be catalogued as evidence in a case that was never formally tried. There were journals, dozens of them dating back to 1962. There were blueprints for a fallout shelter that had never been built. There were newspaper clippings about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and the Gulf War, each annotated in Thomas's meticulous handwriting. And there was a letter, written in 1983, addressed to no one, that began, "When the world ends, we will be the only ones who remember what it was." Thomas Devlin's journals revealed a man consumed by a singular, unshakable belief that nuclear war was not a possibility, but an inevitability, and that survival depended on complete isolation from a society too ignorant to prepare. The earliest entries, written when he was barely 20 years old, described his childhood during the height of the Cold War. He had been 8 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis, old enough to understand the terror in his mother's voice when she packed their basement with canned food and bottled water. He wrote about the drills at school, the way children were taught to hide under desks as if wood and metal could shield them from atomic fire. But what affected him most, he claimed, was the speed with which people forgot. By the 1970s, Thomas observed, America had moved on. The threat had not disappeared, the missiles still existed, the geopolitical tensions still simmered, but the public had grown complacent. They stopped building shelters, they stopped stocking supplies. They convinced themselves that mutually assured destruction was a deterrent rather than a countdown. Thomas saw this as a collective delusion, a societal death wish. In 1976, he married Ruth Caldwell, a woman he described as one of the few who still understands. Together, they made a pact. They would raise their children outside the system, away from the lies, prepared for the collapse that everyone else refused to see coming. The couple purchased the Harlan County property in 1978 using money Thomas had inherited from his father. They began homeschooling their children, not with state-approved curricula, but with lessons designed to ensure survival in a post-apocalyptic world. Mathematics focused on rationing and resource management. Science lessons covered radiation, contamination, and basic medicine. History was taught as a chronicle of humanity's repeated failures to prevent its own annihilation. The children learned no music, no art, no literature beyond the Bible. Entertainment was a distraction. Socialization was a vulnerability. The only thing that mattered was readiness. Ruth's role, according to the journals, was to maintain what Thomas called psychological resilience. She drilled the children on worst-case scenarios, describing in vivid detail what would happen if they were caught outside during a nuclear strike. The flash of light, the wave of heat, the slow death from radiation sickness. She made them practice silence for hours at a time, explaining that noise could attract desperate survivors willing to kill for food. She taught them that trust was a luxury they could not afford, that even neighbors, especially neighbors, would become enemies when resources ran out. The children were not being abused, Thomas insisted in his writings. They were being saved. As the investigation deepened, authorities began to understand that the Devlin children had been living in a state of perpetual psychological siege. Their entire worldview had been constructed around a single, imminent catastrophe that their parents had convinced them was always just days or weeks away. Samuel, the eldest, explained to investigators that his father would periodically announce condition red drills, during which the family would retreat to the basement and live as if the bombs had already fallen. They would ration their food, drink only stored water, and communicate in whispers. These drills sometimes lasted for days. The children were never told when they would end. They simply waited in the dark until their father decided the simulation was over. What made this particularly disturbing was the discovery that Thomas had been escalating these drills over the years. In the early 1980s, they were occasional exercises, perhaps once or twice a year. By the late 80s, they were happening monthly. In 1990, the year before Thomas's stroke, the family had spent more time in the basement than in the rest of the house. The children's sleep cycles had been deliberately disrupted to simulate the chaos of survival. Their meals had been reduced to near-starvation rations to teach them, as Thomas wrote, what hunger truly means. Samuel told investigators that his youngest sister, Miriam, had been born in the basement during one of these drills. Ruth had refused to go to a hospital, insisting that in the real event there would be no hospitals, no doctors, no help. The psychological evaluations painted a picture of children who functioned normally within the narrow parameters their parents had established, but who struggled to comprehend the basic assumptions of the world outside. They had no concept of leisure, no understanding of fiction, no framework for processing emotions beyond fear and discipline. When shown a television for the first time, 12-year-old Nathaniel asked if it was a surveillance device. When given a choice of what to eat for dinner, 14-year-old Leah experienced what the psychologist described as a decision paralysis breakdown, unable to reconcile the idea that food could be chosen rather than rationed. The children were not unintelligent, in fact. Their problem-solving abilities and spatial reasoning tested remarkably high. But they had been so thoroughly shaped by their parents' delusion that they could not distinguish between preparation and paranoia. County officials faced an unprecedented dilemma. Thomas and Ruth Devlin had not physically harmed their children in any legally actionable way. They had fed them, clothed them, and provided shelter. Kentucky homeschooling laws in 1991 were vague enough that the Devlins' curriculum, while bizarre, was not explicitly illegal. The question became, could a belief system itself constitute abuse? Could raising children to live in constant fear of an event that had not occurred and might never occur be considered psychological damage? The case attracted attention from legal scholars, child welfare advocates, and civil liberties groups, each with conflicting interpretations of where parental rights ended and state intervention should begin. Thomas Devlin survived his stroke, but was left partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. Ruth recovered from her pneumonia but fell into what doctors described as a dissociative state, rarely acknowledging the presence of others and spending hours staring at walls. Neither parent was deemed competent to regain custody of their children. The state placed the 7 Devlin children in foster care, splitting them among 3 different families in an attempt to provide individualized attention and prevent them from reinforcing each other's conditioned fears. It was a decision that, in hindsight, many would question. Samuel, Leah, and Nathaniel were placed with a family in Lexington. Esther and Caleb went to a couple in Bowling Green. The 2 youngest, Miriam and 6-year-old Jonah, were sent to a home in Louisville. The foster families had been briefed on the children's unusual upbringing, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of integration. Samuel refused to sleep in a bed, insisting on lying on the floor near the door. Leah hoarded food in her room, hiding bread and canned goods under her mattress. Nathaniel would wake at dawn and stand at attention until someone gave him instructions. The younger children fared no better. Caleb had violent nightmares about fire and suffocation. Miriam would not eat unless someone else tasted her food first, a behavior Ruth had apparently instilled to protect against poisoning in a post-collapse world. Therapists worked with the children for months, attempting to introduce concepts like safety, normalcy, and trust. Progress was slow and uneven. Some of the children, particularly the younger ones, began to adapt. Jonah started playing with toys. Miriam learned to smile. But the older children remained trapped in the worldview their parents had constructed. Samuel told his therapist that he felt like he was waiting for something that never comes, as if the world were holding its breath. Leah expressed guilt for eating full meals, convinced she was wasting resources that would be needed later. Nathaniel asked repeatedly when he would be allowed to go home, not understanding that the home he remembered had been a prison. The foster families, despite their best efforts, struggled with the emotional toll. One family reported that Samuel had tried to secure the perimeter of their suburban home, checking locks and windows obsessively and asking where they kept their emergency supplies. Another family found that Esther had been teaching Caleb to identify edible plants in their backyard, explaining that, when the stores close forever, this is what we'll eat. The children were not being defiant. They were simply doing what they had been trained to do. And that training ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In October of 1992, nearly 2 years after the children had been removed from the Devlin home, something happened that forced everyone involved to reconsider what they thought they understood. Samuel Devlin, now 19 years old and legally an adult, petitioned the court for permission to visit his parents. The request was unusual but not illegal. His foster family, exhausted and increasingly concerned about his inability to adjust, did not object. A supervised visit was arranged at the long-term care facility where Thomas and Ruth had been placed. What occurred during that visit was documented by a social worker who observed through a one-way mirror. Samuel entered the room and immediately knelt beside his father's wheelchair. Thomas, despite his limited speech, became animated in a way staff had never seen. He gripped Samuel's hand and repeated a single phrase over and over, slurred but unmistakable. "You were right to wait." Ruth, who had barely spoken in months, turned to her son and said, clearly and calmly, "It's not over. It's never over." Samuel did not argue. He did not reassure them that the world was safe. Instead, he nodded, and for the first time since his removal, the social worker reported, he looked at peace. Within 6 months, Samuel had moved out of his foster home and disappeared from the social services system. He was legally an adult, and the state had no authority to track him. Leah followed shortly after her 18th birthday. Then Nathaniel. One by one, as the older Devlin children aged out of state custody, they vanished from public record. Attempts to locate them were unsuccessful. They had no social security earnings, no driver's licenses, no credit histories. It was as if they had stepped backward into the world their parents had created. A world that existed parallel to ours, but separate from it. The younger children remained in foster care longer, and their outcomes were mixed. Esther, after years of therapy, eventually enrolled in community college and tried to build a normal life, though friends described her as perpetually anxious, always planning for disasters that never came. Caleb struggled with addiction in his 20s, later stating in a rare interview that he had been trying to turn off the fear his parents had wired into him. Jonah adapted best of the 7, forming attachments to his foster family and eventually being adopted. But even he admitted, years later, that he still kept a supply of canned food in his basement, still checked the locks twice before bed, still felt a low hum of dread he could never quite name. Miriam's fate remained unknown. Records indicated she had run away from her foster home at age 15. Some reports suggested she had reunited with her older siblings. Others claimed she had been seen in survivalist communities in Idaho and Montana, places where people still believed the world was ending and preparation was the only rational response. No one could confirm anything. The Devlin children had learned their parents' most important lesson: how to disappear. Thomas Devlin died in 1998 from complications related to his stroke. Ruth lived until 2006. Spending her final years in near total silence. Neither parent ever expressed regret for how they raised their children. In fact, the few times Ruth spoke coherently to staff, she insisted that history would prove them right, that the world's reckoning was simply delayed, not cancelled. She died believing she had saved her children from a fate the rest of humanity was still too blind to see coming. The question that haunted investigators, therapists, and foster families was whether she had saved them or destroyed them. The Devlin case was quietly closed, its records sealed to protect the privacy of the children, but those who worked on it never forgot. Margaret Hines, the social worker who first entered that farmhouse, gave a single interview before her retirement in 2009. She said the hardest part was not what the Devlins had done to their children, but the realization that on some level, Thomas and Ruth had acted out of love. They genuinely believed they were protecting their family. They had looked at the world at its weapons, its fragility, its history of violence, and concluded that trust was fatal, that hope was delusion, that the only moral choice was to prepare for the worst. And they had raised their children accordingly, not with cruelty but with conviction. What made the story truly disturbing, Hines said, was that the Devlins were not insane. They were not abusive in any traditional sense. They were simply people who had taken a rational fear and followed it to its most extreme conclusion. The Cold War had taught an entire generation that annihilation was possible. The Devlins had simply refused to forget, and in doing so, they had created a family that could never fully belong to the world the rest of us inhabited. Their children had been trained to survive an apocalypse, but no one had taught them how to survive peace. In 2018, a journalist investigating survivalist movements in the Pacific Northwest claimed to have encountered a woman in her early 30s who matched Miriam Devlin's description. The woman was living in an off-grid community, teaching others how to purify water and forage for food. When asked her name, she gave a false one. When asked about her childhood, she said only that her parents had prepared her for something that hadn't happened yet. The journalist noted that she spoke about the future not with hope or fear, but with a strange, patient certainty, as if she were still waiting in that basement, still listening for the sirens, still holding her breath for the flash of light that would prove her parents right. The Devlin children are out there somewhere. Some have tried to build new lives, some have vanished into the margins of society, and some, perhaps, are still preparing, still teaching their own children the lessons Thomas and Ruth taught them. The world did not end in 1991. It did not end in 2006. It has not ended yet. But for the Devlin family, it ended a long time ago, the moment Thomas decided that love meant teaching his children to live as if tomorrow would never come. And the most disturbing truth of all is that we may never know if they were saved or if they were lost, because in the world their parents built, there was no difference between the two.